Hello and welcome to the Overland Journal podcast. I am your host, Scott Brady, and I'm here with my co-host for today, Matt Swartz. We're sticking with the Matt theme on co-hosts, so I always get the name right. It's always a Matt. Matt Swartz is quite different from Matt Scott in the fact that, Matt, you have a long history in the outdoor space and a lot of time living out of vehicles, including a historic Cortez that you had. We did do a podcast with Matt and his partner, Amanda, last year at some point, if you want to hear more about his travels and his experience on the road. But one of the things that you learned about is how do you maintain all of these systems when you're in the middle of nowhere? How do you keep working? How do you be a creative and do the job that you and Amanda do when you're in the middle of nowhere? And that's what we're going to talk about today. We're going to talk about portable power systems primarily, but we're going to also talk a little bit about power systems in general for the vehicle. So thanks for being on today, Matt. Thanks to this week's sponsor, GCI Outdoor. Whether you're heading out for a weekend of adventure in the woods or to your backyard fire pit, GCI Outdoor gear is ready for whatever you have planned. GCI Outdoor has been around for 25 years, so they know what they're doing when it comes to the best in portable recreation gear. GCI has innovative products ranging from outdoor rockers to complete camp kitchens and everything in between. And with a limited lifetime warranty, you know they stand behind everything they make. GCI Outdoor gear is comfortable, durable, and built for adventures, big and small. Try them out for yourself. Head over to their website at gcioutdoor.com and save 10% off your first purchase when you sign up for their email list. Thanks again, GCI.
Yeah, I'm excited. This is a topic that I think so many people have questions around, want to know more about. Electricity can be a little intimidating, honestly. You know, it can kill you.
Yeah, sure.
But it can also make your life a lot more comfortable and easy on the road, like you alluded to. My background is in just general outdoor space, backpacking, rock climbing, things like that. And I came to vehicle-based travel in 2016 in the Cortez. That was our first vehicle we traveled in. And we did install a full standalone solar power system so that we could continue working on the road and also have some conveniences. So there's a huge amount of value in having an auxiliary or house power system in your truck or RV or camper. There are a lot of options too. There's no one right way to do it. You know, there are a handful of ways to execute that.
Yeah. And I think that we're going to start off by talking about the three basic systems that we tend to see within vehicles. So there's going to be a dual battery system, which is the most common. It's been around the longest. It's been used by overlanders for a long time and for purposes beyond powering electronics and house systems. So dual battery systems were used as an additional way to start the vehicle if the primary starting battery had failed or gone flat. It was also a way to augment available power for winching operations. If you were driving at low speeds at night, it used to be that vehicles had much lower outputs in their alternator. In fact, I think you mentioned about that in your Cortez was one of the challenges is that your alternator only put out so many amps from an older vehicle. They just really only at times generate 30, 40, 50 amps when they're at idle, whereas a modern vehicle oftentimes put out many times that. Dual battery systems are the more traditional method of adding additional power to your vehicle. And now we have dedicated house systems. So that would be similar to like what you did in the Cortez and that we'll find in most camper systems, but they're also still very popular in SUVs where you have a totally separate house battery. It's oftentimes lithium ion. It's rarely, if ever, used for assisting with starting. It's a way to completely isolate the starting and vehicle systems from the camping and house systems. And it's typically supported while underway with some kind of a DC to DC charging system. So that way, when the alternator starts putting out alternator level current at usually 13.4 or 13.6 volts or higher, then the DC to DC converter will kick in and it'll start charging that house battery system. And oftentimes those systems are augmented with solar that's maybe permanently affixed to the vehicle or solar blankets or solar panels that are deployed while in camp. And we're also seeing more and more vehicles using other solutions like wind generators and things like that that can help provide additional power when you're even in bad weather with very limited sun. And then, of course, the third one, which is what we're going to focus on a lot more today because it has become such a compelling option, is a portable power system like you see from Dometic and from Goal Zero and others. And Matt, you were the primary research and testing editor for the article that we had in the the fall 2021 Overland Journal issue where you compared all of the primary or the most notable power systems that were on the market. What did you find out in the beginning that maybe kind of shook some of your understanding of how all this works?
I think just taking a step back, we installed a standalone hardwired system in our RV because it felt like at the time, some of these standalone, one unit does everything solutions were a little bit limited in scope and what they could do. And I think that was what I was most pleasantly surprised about when I started doing the research for this article, was that these units are very capable by themselves. They incorporate everything in a standard solar system. There's a charge controller to manage input from solar panels or a DC power source. So that could be, coming from your alternator. They have an AC inverter in most of them. So you can get AC current to run household appliances, the typical stuff you would plug in your house to the wall with the 2-prong, that's AC power. They also provide 12-volt output in the form of USB-A, USB-C, or sometimes, more standardized 12-volt interface like the Anderson power pole type plugs.
Sure.
Things that can handle higher amperage like 30 amp output. You could theoretically power a hardwired system from one of these all-in-one units through a 30 amp plug.
And that's actually what I've experienced in the Scout, which is such a great example of an OEM camper manufacturer deciding to eschew the traditional house system with solar panels and everything else with separate batteries. And they use a Goal Zero Yeti. They use the 1500X.
That's this unit right here.
Which is the unit right next to Matt there for those of you that are watching on YouTube. It has been totally flawless in the Scout. In fact, it's been so reliable. I just leave everything running in the camper with it just stored and off of the vehicle. So the camper has a 180 watt solar panel installed on the front of it. It allows me to leave the windows cracked ever so slightly so I don't get weather in, but I let the 12 volt fan run all the time. Mm-hmm. So it keeps the camper constantly ventilated out for moisture and mildew and anything else that may happen. And what was really impressive to me, and this again, kind of what you experienced, I had no idea they had come so far in the fact that they now have fully integrated solar charge controllers. It used to be that you could only use the Yeti or the Goal Zero panel with a specific amount of voltage and a very specific connector that went into the unit. Now they still have that same connector so that they are backwards compatible to their other products, but they also have an Anderson style charging port for the solar panels. So this is a totally different manufacturer of solar. It has a much broader range of solar voltage that the system can consume now. And it shows this like reassuring little blue flashing light that the solar panels are constantly providing power. And I look down and I'm getting 96 watts out of these panels, or I'm getting 105, or even if it's a cloudy day, I'm seeing 30 or 40 watts out of these panels. And that's very cool. And the other thing that was so surprising is that, and I don't know how many of the other Goal Zero products offer this, but the 1500X has an additional module that can be installed under where the lid is that allows for a DC to DC charger. So you install this additional auxiliary module and it can take up to 50 amps of 12 volt current from the alternator to rapidly charge the battery system within the 1500X. So it's literally everything that I need for an expedition camper like that for the kind of power consumption that I do. I obviously don't run a hair dryer or a microwave or anything like that. So if you need just regular power consumption, it does that. And then because it has an Anderson style 12 volt outlet, you take the entire wiring harness from the camper and you plug it into one port on the 1500X. It runs all the lights, the fans, the 12 volt outlet for the Wii Boost. It runs all of it off of that one box. So that's pretty impressive.
Yeah. And it gives you the flexibility to pull the brain, so to speak, out of the camper if you have issues, right? Like if there's ever an issue with the battery, with the charge controller, with the AC inverter, which are all contained within the Yeti, you just pull it out, send it to Goal Zero for service, and your wiring remains intact in the camper. You don't have to mess with any of that. It's really cool. Like you mentioned with that module for 50 amp input, they also have a module you can connect that allows you to daisy chain external batteries for extra storage. And they sell basically these systems that are designed to run your home in an emergency power outage. So, and a bunch of manufacturers do offer that. We're mentioning the Yeti 1500 and Goal Zero specifically. I think because, that in the article was my editor's choice. Cost aside, it is the most expensive unit that we tested for that particular article, but it's just so rich with features and functionality that, it's just, it was hands down for me the best one. Renogy, EcoFlow, a lot of these other kind of up and coming or established companies in the space are making external units that you can get, or I should say external battery storage that can be plugged into the base unit, so to speak. So you can just get crazy amounts of power storage, maybe not quite equivalent to like a Tesla Powerwall, but kind of aiming at that market, people who want to be prepared for a power outage at home,
or for a week in the backcountry with bad weather where you're not getting solar and you're not really running the vehicle.
Sure.
It's pretty impressive what you can get out of those. And I've not had any issues with mine. The only thing that I found with long-term use with the Yeti is that they have got some kind of an alarm on it that has nothing to do with the unit faulting or failing. Like all the numbers are good. The battery levels are, I think it's something to do with the Bluetooth or some kind of Wi-Fi connection or something.
And it does have both.
And every once in a while it'll start beeping. And I've tried everything that I probably need to just give them a call because there's no information about how to make it stop.
Interesting.
Beeping. So
yeah. I think
it's funny how those things come up. Like this is just like as an information to the manufacturers. If you're listening, there's never a reason for something to just start beeping unless it's really bad. Like show it on the display. You have this very rich display. Yep. Show the information that you're trying to communicate on a display, not at 3:00 in the morning.
Yeah. One thing you also mentioned, Rich, which I think bears repeating, is the flexibility of these units. You talked about kind of the cross compatibility, and I realized that recently. Amanda and I were just down in Southern California with the Airstream. We were staying at Saboba Flight Park, the hat that I'm wearing right now.
Nice.
It's a paragliding spot. But it was funny because long story short, we don't have an AC inverter in our Airstream. One of the great questions that remains, it's not a question. Airstreams are not generally designed for people who are spending large amounts of time off grid. So it's an option, but they don't come with it. So anyway, we're carrying around a Yeti with us for AC power when we don't have a shore power hookup. And I actually didn't bring the Goal Zero panels with me. I had 2 Jackery panels with me.
Gotcha.
And they worked with the Yeti system.
Oh, that's cool.
No problem.
And 10 years ago, that wouldn't have been the case. They wouldn't have been compatible.
Right.
Or they would have required some modification to work.
Yeah. And what I've found is most of these units now are smart enough. If you plug an input in, it has internal circuitry to identify the input, to know whether it's acceptable to manage the voltage, power from that, and either it will not allow the input or it will give you some sort of a warning or an error. You don't get that with hardwired systems necessarily. True. You have to know what plug goes where, what kind of voltages and amperages you can put into the system there. So I think that's one of the other big advantages. They take a lot of the guesswork out of it. And coming back to safety, electricity is kind of can be a dangerous thing if you don't know how to work with it safely.
Yeah, particularly at 120 volts.
Yeah, these just make it so much safer, at least that's my experience too.
No, totally. You don't end up opening them up at all. They do have some limitations. One of the downsides is the fact that you've put all of your eggs in one basket. So when you have your own system like you built in your RV, if it starts to behave differently because you installed all of it, you're like, I know what that is.
Right.
Or I can go to the local RV store and I can buy this one solar charge controller and replace it. And now the whole system is back up and running.
Sure.
Whereas with these all-in-one units, that is something that's worth noting is if they do have a problem, typically it brings down the whole system.
Right. I mean, if this stops working, you're not going to open the case up yourself to deal with it, unless maybe you're an electrical engineer,
Sure.
But then you're also probably voiding your warranty, So,
Correct.
A perfect example is in a hardwired system, like the one we had in our Cortez. We got 2 100 amp hour lead acid batteries or AGM batteries. They were $100 a piece because we got them used and they lasted us 3 years.
Wow.
That's the same amp hour capacity as this.
Yeah,
and this
sure.
is $2,000. Now, this is a lot more than just batteries, so it's not fair to compare the two. But the point being, batteries have a finite lifetime. And in our system that was all put together piece by piece, we could easily replace just one thing. And with this, yes, if it goes down, you're going to ship it away and you're going to need to wait. With everything, you're going to run into those limitations, right?
There's compromises.
There's trade-offs, I mean, we were kind of talking about that before. Even introducing electricity and an auxiliary electrical system into a vehicle is inherently putting more complexity into it, you know, and that's something you may have to deal with on the road if it doesn't function as expected.
Yeah, I remember for those that are listening that would kind of like to know a little bit about maybe one of the OGs of overlanding. There's a gentleman by the name of Tom Shepard. He lives in the UK, and he is certainly a mentor of mine and someone that I have looked up to for decades because of his significant expeditions across the Sahara, Northern Africa, and other places around the world. But I was visiting with him in the UK, and he had built up this G-Wagon for travel in Algeria. And he was saying, and I have a second battery. And I said, well, what do you use for a dual battery system? And he kind of gets this twinkle in his eye, and he brings the back seat of the passenger seat forward. And there's just one of those mechanical switches that is off, battery number 1, battery number 2, and combine or all. Like, he was the dual battery system. Mm-hmm. It was a mechanical switch that managed all of his battery systems. Now, if you think about it, that's the easiest, most inexpensive, but it's also the most failure prone because like I probably don't have the memory of things like that, like Tom does, where he probably has a checklist at the end of every day and he makes sure to shut this off or to turn that to where he needs it to be. If you leave those two combined and you go out for a hike and you left the lights on, now the car doesn't start. That's the nice thing about some of these automated systems, but it is certainly possible to build an auxiliary battery system into your vehicle very inexpensively. And I'm glad that you brought up the point that you did about the Cortez and those used batteries. Lithium ion batteries are the hot new thing for a lot of reasons. They're super great. Yeah. Especially on the weight reduction and the size of the packaging reduction side.
I was going to say power density is good. The weight savings is huge. And the cycles, they get a lot more cycles in their lifetime than an AGM. I mean,
they have a lot of built-in protection too.
They do. Yeah. A lot of them now have these battery management systems built in that control the charging voltage and, they monitor temperature for ideal conditions. They're obviously a bigger investment up front. They're many times the cost of AGM batteries or lead acid, but in the long run, they are a better investment, at least as far as I've been led to believe. Now, I
think you're right, but to your point too, is like, that's the opportunity, because when we talk about a principle of overlanding, like we are today around portable battery systems, we also want to always make sure that we present what's the lowest cost option for the listener, because there are many times when a system like Tom Shepard uses, and he's one of the most accomplished overlanders on the planet, his is literally belts and suspenders. It is a switch that he turns mechanically with his hand. He has 2 batteries and a small length of wire, and that does everything that he needs it to do when he's traveling for months in the backcountry. You found some used AGMs. How likely is it that somewhere on Expedition Portal or some other forum that there is a bunch of people who want to put in lithium batteries and they're selling their used Odyssey AGMs? And these are great batteries, and you can buy them for a fraction of the cost of what they were new. And then you either put in a mechanical system or you put in a simple isolator or DC to DC controller. And for a couple $100, you've solved a problem that can also cost thousands in different fashions. So there are other ways to skin this cat, and we don't want anyone listening to think that these portable systems that are very complex and have a lot of features and are very robust is the only way to go about this. There are less expensive ways.
Yeah, absolutely. And there are some great options kind of in the middle too, like National Luna has this, it's like a portable unit.
Yeah, power pack, they call it, or something.
It was actually, if you look at the back, it's the final page of the article, but I put it in there, I thought it was important to give it a nod because it's under $400, and it basically lets you take any 12-volt battery and hook up a positive and a negative lead. And then it gives you a couple 12-volt outlets. And I think
there's some USBs in there, I believe.
It does. I don't think that one had an AC output built into it.
It does not, but it does have a built-in dual battery system.
Right. And you can easily go to, an Ace Hardware or a Pep Boys and buy yourself, like a 300 watt AC inverter that plugs into a 12-volt outlet. Mm-hmm. And then for under $500, you have a 12-volt system that you don't have to have almost any electrical knowledge to put together.
Yeah.
And you get AC and DC power. And you could do it it with a used battery, like you just mentioned.
Yeah, great example. And the National Luna stuff is known for its long-term durability. They build extremely robust, long-lasting systems because of the environment that they're designed for, being in Southern Africa. So that's a great example.
One thing I'm kind of curious about, and I feel like with your knowledge of, off-road and overland travel, you probably have a better understanding of this. How is a dual battery system different than a house battery system? Or are they not different?
They can be the same. Traditionally, a dual battery system was used, and they kind of first showed up around larger displacement engines, and particularly diesels.
I was going to say, because for instance, in the Ram that I've got, it has two batteries. Yeah. Like that's standard. That's the way it works.
Yeah. So the primary reason why they showed up was that in cold climates, you have your engine is 6.6 liters, something like that.
6.7. Yeah.
6.7 liters. Okay. Yep. And it's a diesel, which has
high compression,
a minimum of 22 to 1 compression. Some of them are a little higher than that. So you have a large displacement engine with a lot of compression that you have to turn at a high enough rate to get that diesel cycle to begin. So that's the reason why many diesel vehicles, and particularly ones with larger displacement engines, will have dual battery systems.
Got it.
And that is to increase the total available cold cranking amps for primarily cold climates. And that's where it kind of started from. However, there was recreational and there was backcountry applications. There was like farm applications and other things where they needed to be able to operate winches, or they needed to be able to operate other powered devices out in the field, where they wanted to be able to isolate the starting of the engine from the function of those other systems. In the four-wheel drive space, a dual battery system on something like a Jeep Wrangler would have been installed primarily to, I've killed my main starting battery because I've been winching. So you can do that. A winch will pull
amounts of power,
hundreds of amps a minute. So, they can, if you're not getting any power in, you can flatten, depending on the size of the winch, you can flatten a battery in a matter of just a few minutes. And now you can't restart your engine. So they would install a second battery, so then they could flip a switch, combine the two, restart the engine, let the batteries charge back up again. Or if you were at the end of a very complex winching operation and the winch was getting drawn down because the voltage of the system was getting dropped down, you could also combine them to give the winch that last little bit of extra energy to get through the obstacle. So that was typically why you would see a dual battery system in a recreational vehicle or an early overland vehicle, was redundancy for starting and to support heavy winching operations.
And it could help with other things like driving lights. I imagine, some of these high wattage driving lights probably pull a decent amount of power.
And 15, 20 years ago, vehicles just didn't have that high of an output from their alternators. So a lot of dual battery systems were for just that kind of scenario. It's raining. It's cold. So you have your heater blower running. You have your windshield wipers running. You have your headlights and your auxiliary lights on. You're driving at low speed, so low RPM, low output from the alternator. And all of a sudden, all the lights start getting very, very yellow and very dim because the vehicles just didn't generate that much power. I remember my first Land Cruiser, an FJ40 that I had, I think it had a 35 amp alternator. That was very, very low power.
Got it.
So a dual battery system on a vehicle like that was pretty popular. Whereas today, dual battery systems are most often used to support all of these complex electronics that we bring along, fridges and everything else like that. And that's when you start to make the transition from thinking it as a way of supporting four-wheel drive mechanical support, like in winching, to I'm going to now run my house systems separately from the vehicle electronics. And that's one of the mistakes that people make the most often, in my mind, is that they too heavily integrate the two. You want to make sure that your house systems are fully, if very close to fully isolated from your vehicle systems. You want to minimize the number of electronics that run out of the factory 12 volt sockets. You want to minimize the amount of battery power that you're pulling from the starting battery. You want to have a separate house system, which could be a battery or one of these boxes like we're talking about today. And you want to have some kind of an isolation between the two. That way, if you're watching Netflix for too long or whatever, you ran the blender too many times at night and you've flattened the house battery, you haven't killed your starting battery.
Right. You don't even touch it. And that is,
you keep them totally isolated.
I was going to say the isolator, if for people that are interested in setting up a system like this, I mean, that's a pretty inexpensive thing. And even to pay to have someone install that, I imagine it's not that expensive in the scheme of things. So
no, they're not. And something like a National Luna dual battery system, or there's some other great ones from Red Arc that are also mechanical, or they're solid state from other manufacturers. There's some MOSFET solid state battery isolators. There's a bunch of different options out there. There's another one called IBS that is a great quality unit, and those are all very easy to install.
That's good to know. Yeah, in our RV in the Cortez, we didn't even use an isolator. The two systems, the vehicle starter battery and our off-grid power, were completely isolated from one another.
Smart.
And there were advantages and disadvantages. Like I remember spending an extended time in Northern California where we had very little light. It was in the winter. There was tree cover, and we just weren't getting the charging from the panels, even on a good day. If we had them integrated, we could have just started the vehicle and run it for, 20 minutes and topped off the batteries. We didn't have that option. So there are advantages to having them connected to a certain degree. But as you pointed out, you want to make sure they're separated so you don't risk drying down your starter.
Correct.
As well as the house.
Yeah.
battery.
Our goal is to get remote. And it's so interesting. These, even a fridge, there's so many of these systems that take so much power. You can lose track of time. The hike takes a little longer than you think, and you forgot some lights were on or whatever. It's very easy to flatten a battery.
Yeah. Yeah. We've had a couple times where we drew our batteries down too low, and when they get low, and I've noticed it with these battery boxes, the all-in-one units, as well as, standalone systems, the low end recharging feels like it takes forever. If you get down to the 15-20% range, it's like exponentially longer to get charge into the battery than if you keep them towards the top end of power storage.
And that makes sense. Electrical current is more efficient the higher the voltage. So if you're starting with a very low voltage battery, it's going to recharge more slowly at the lowest voltage than it will at the highest end of the voltage. So the first 25% is going to take a lot longer than the last 25%. It's also important for those that are listening to understand what is the limits of your batteries. Each manufacturer should have a way of expressing what they consider to be an appropriate level of depth of draw. So a traditional AGM like you had in your RV, those are going to normally be around 50% depth of draw.
Yep.
It's going to depend on the manufacturer of the battery, but it normally is right at 12 volts. So people will think like, oh, I'm only at 50%. Well, no, if you're down at 30% and you're at 11.6 volts or 11.4 volts, you're already starting to do damage to the batteries. That's where these lithiums are very clever and they're very smart. And something like on the Yeti from Goal Zero, it's very intelligent in how it communicates its current state of charge.
Yeah, from my research that I did for the article, using this as an example again, when it says 0 on the display, it's not actually 0. They build in that buffer to help you prevent damage to the batteries. Although lithium can be drawn down fairly low without damaging the batteries. And the cool thing with this is you can go into a smartphone app and you can adjust that. If you
interesting. The threshold.
You can, cool. Yeah, you can adjust that. This one, you can also update charging profile. There's a lot of stuff you can do that kind of future proofs this to a certain degree, which is cool. Yeah. The AGMs, I mean,
very sensitive to that.
They are. Yeah. And we drew ours down too far, and you notice it affects the overall life of them. Like you said, 50%. So really, our 200 amp hour AGM setup is really the same power as a 100 amp hour lithium battery. It like give or take, they're so similar in that way.
So it's really important when you install like the Victron battery monitoring gauge in your vehicle, or when you buy a camper, that you ask the camper manufacturer, what is this set to? Is it set to, is 0% at the manufacturer's limit for depth of draw, or is 0% means the battery is now at 10% or 10 volts and I've done a bunch of damage to it? So I actually like to put most of those gauges, reflect them in voltage. These are 12 volt systems. If you go below 12 volts on a battery, with some exceptions like lithium, you're starting to do damage to the battery itself.
Sure. I actually found some interesting results around that too, because when you get into 12 volt applications, a lot of appliances rely on that voltage needs to be 12 or higher for them to function properly.
Correct.
And one example of that is, for instance, we were running an ARB fridge in our camper, and our system is an AGM system. And so all of our 12 volt outputs were coming directly from the battery. They weren't regulated. So what happens with that is when the voltage of the batteries gets too low, if you're running the ARB fridge with the 12 volt power source, it actually will just turn off, even though the battery's not dead, so to speak.
Sure.
And that was a surprise to me. Once I learned that, I realized the value of running that off AC power occasionally, because the AC inverter can pull power from the batteries when they're below 12% and still output that 120
below
volt.
12 volts. Sure.
Yep. Now
that's clever. Yeah.
Now on all of the units that I tested for the article, that was one of the things that I was really interested in. I thought to myself, if the voltage drops below 12 volts, will they still power a 12 volt appliance? And so I plugged 12 volt fridges with the 12 volt connectors into all of these. And I also used a multimeter and I tested, and all of the 12 volt outputs on these units are regulated. So what happens is, even if the battery drops below 12 volts, it still puts out a standardized voltage somewhere in the neighborhood of, let's say, 12.4. I don't understand electrical engineering enough to explain to you how that works.
Yeah. So it's up voltaging it, which costs additional power.
Right.
So if you're trying, it's like you would do from going from 12 volts to 120 volts, you're consuming power to up voltage it to that next level. So that's interesting. So it even accelerates the rate that the battery is running out of power.
But it is an
cool.
advantage, because, if you have a 12 volt appliance that you need to run and the battery drops below 12 volts,
sure,
you can do that. I mean, I've seen the voltage on the battery on the Yeti drop like down into the 10 point whatever range, and it will still put out power. And that's like, wow, maybe when it gets down to 20%. And with this, as far as I understand, you're not doing any damage. The system will stop working basically at the point where you would do damage to it. I think you can affect long-term function of the batteries, so I shouldn't say you're not doing any damage, but it will still function.
Yeah.
So
but it has regulated, some fail safes in play.
It does. Yeah. It tries to keep you from destroying it.
Well, and so what did you think of, we've talked a lot about the Goal Zero.
Sure.
What were some of the other units? It looks like you also evaluated the Renogy. How did that one work? That one's like on wheels with a cart kind of a thing. It's a much bigger unit.
Yeah. So the Renogy's cool. The Renogy, it feels a little dated, if I'm being honest, compared to some of the units that are available now. And I think that's just because they have put a little bit more effort into their commercial and standalone units in the 12 volt and solar space. They're super well known for solar panels. They make a really affordable, decent quality solar panel. I think you can get them for like under $100 on Amazon, a rigid solar panel. And they make a lot of solar components that are good quality and affordable. So I think that's where the majority of the company's effort is, not in units like this. Now, I still think that their all-in-one power solution, this Lycan power box that we tried, was great. It worked well. It's got a lot of USB-As. It's got a lot of 12 volt barrel inputs, which feels like, again, a little dated. USB-C is kind of becoming a standard in the 12 volt space for USB charging. The 12 volt barrel adapters, there are not that many things out there that you would utilize for that. There's some
like a fridge, I guess, would be one that you'd plug in.
Yeah. But, in my experience, even I think it's called like a Hella adapter.
Yep.
These are smaller. They're really small diameter, like for running like LED string lights and stuff.
Oh, I see what you're saying. I gotcha.
Yeah. Yeah. They're
kind of like the round one on the Goal Zero.
Yeah. You can see them. They're right above the USBs there, so it's more like, if you think about like, let's say like a little,
I see that
USB speaker that has a 12 volt adapter with a barrel style plug. It's those round ones. So
got it.
They have limited use, I think, in general. The cool thing about the Renogy, though, is it will charge lead acid batteries. So you can have auxiliary 12 volt batteries and it will manage charging of them. So that's neat. And definitely the handle and the wheels are great. These things are all pretty heavy. I mean, I think they're like anywhere from 30 to 50 pounds. So wheels are smart, save your back.
Is the Renogy lithium?
The Renogy is lithium, I believe. Yeah. Okay. Everything we tested is lithium, as far as I know, as far as I remember. Yeah. I think everything I tested was lithium. But yeah, so the Renogy was good. It has a lot of outlets. It was somewhat limited in terms of the information that it provides on the display. That's where, coming back to the Yeti again, it got the editor's choice for a lot of reasons. And that was one of the other reasons. You get so much information on the display. The Renogy gives you some information. It doesn't, if I'm remembering right, it doesn't estimate time till empty. It doesn't tell you how much power you're drawing. It just tells you in a percentage what the batteries are at.
Yeah.
So,
and I like that about the Goal Zero a lot. to know how many watts is coming in and how many watts are being consumed. That's a great way to plan for how your day is going to go.
Yeah, definitely. So, I mean, you can extrapolate that, plug in a device, turn it on, see what it draws. It will estimate how much time is left, but you also know the power density. You can do some math and figure out how many hours it should run for if you want to figure that out.
And what I did on the Goal Zero is, since it has the small Anderson connection, I put one of those PowerWorks meters between that and the wiring loom for the camper. That way I can see what exactly is the camper drawing, as opposed to laptops that are plugged in or other accessories that are plugged into the Goal Zero. I can see exactly what the camper is consuming, which was pretty interesting insights.
That's pretty cool. Yeah. And it's fun to validate any number that you see on the display with an external device. I mean, we did that for the test. I used, it's not fancy, but one of those kilowatt meters for our AC load testing. And there is a variation between what that tells you and what the display tells you on the units. I mean, it would be super fun to do this again and to actually pull an electrical engineer in, have them open up the units and do whatever testing needs to be done to validate a lot of these numbers. Because again, as someone who doesn't have an education around electronics, there's only so much I'm really comfortable doing with these.
Sure.
Renogy was cool. I think the Dometic was an interesting one and a lot different than most of the units, in that it doesn't do AC output. It is just a 12 volt output. And because of that, it is much smaller.
It is. Yeah. It's a very compact unit, super robust handle. I mean, I like the fact that it's as compact of a footprint as it is. It's got kind of an interesting panel on the top, and like you have to hold it. You have to
I have to be honest.
If you don't know,
right,
you got to hold the power button for quite some time before it starts doing its things.
Yep. It's a capacitative touchscreen. So there's no tactile feedback, which is, again, there's limitations with all of these. That was probably the thing I liked least about that unit, but the size is very compelling. Everyone's got space for one of those in their rig.
Quick access to the fuses.
Yep.
Do you remember on this Anderson plug on the back, it says that it's an input, but can you also use it as an output as well? Is it a way to tie it in with a dual battery system?
I don't believe so.
Okay. So the energy only goes one way.
Yeah. As far as I remember on that one, the best use case for that, I think it's made by Dometic. Pair it with a fridge, it will run a fridge for a couple days. It just makes it simple.
And it has USB on there.
Yep.
It didn't have any USB-C, which I think would be an advantage whenever they come out with their next version of the model. But the thing that I did really like about it was the handle, how easy it would be to create some brackets to securely mount it in the back of a vehicle. It would work well in a small vehicle. So it's pretty clever in that way.
Yeah. For someone who just needs 12 volt for maybe a phone, a camera battery, and a fridge.
Yeah.
It does all of that, and it's small and it's easy to carry around. Yeah. I like that one a lot. One of the other ones that's really worth considering. And for a couple of interesting reasons is the EcoFlow products. The Delta is the unit that I tested. The Delta kind of crushed all of the others in its recharge time. Most of these take anywhere from 5 to 12 hours to recharge. The Delta recharges from 20% to 100% in under 2 hours.
Yeah.
Which is really cool. And it's very simple how it does that. It has an integrated charger that accepts like 1700 watts of AC power in. Most of these other ones, the AC chargers that are standard that come with them, accept the maximum of maybe 400 watts AC. So it's not like a mystery how they do it. It's the fact that it can accept 1700 watts. And that's really cool because maybe you want the standalone system and you don't want to figure out a way to recharge from panels. But with this, I mean, you can go and find an AC outlet somewhere and plug in for under 2 hours and
while you're having lunch,
you're topped off. Yeah. You can do that at a coffee shop. You can do it at a cafe pretty easily.
I'll give you a good example of the use case for that unit. With recently purchasing a sailboat, which, as they say, it's like the best day of your life is when you buy a boat, and the second best day is when you sell it. But so I'm in the middle of all of these projects on this sailboat, and there's no 120 volt. There's very limited 12 volt on the boat. So I'm like, I'm going to take one of these test units and just like, I've never used this product. I'm going to go use it while I'm working on the boat. And this thing is fantastic. I mean, it has multiple 120 outlets.
Yeah, I think you get 6 120 outlets.
It effortlessly runs my Nespresso. So I get hot.
That's all you need.
It had my heart at a properly functioning espresso machine. So, I mean, this thing effortlessly does that. It has a bunch of USB-C outlets. So that runs like when I need to charge the nav systems for the boat, or when I need to charge a phone, a camera, a drone, if I need to run my iPad Pro, if I'm doing work on the boat. It does all of those things just absolutely effortless. And it's a surprisingly compact package.
It is. I was going to say, I think the form factor of that one is really smart too. It's narrow, it can fit on a shelf. It can fit into some areas that maybe these bigger units can't easily fit.
No doubt.
And it's also flat on top, which that seems like a silly thing, but being able to securely rest your phone or a USB device on top of the battery that's charging, that is hugely valuable, and some of these have flat tops, some don't, some have fixed handles. Like, the Jackery is great in a lot of ways, but it doesn't easily lend itself to stacking things on top of it.
Sure.
Not that a manufacturer would necessarily recommend stacking things on top of these, but the reality is little things like that in the field go a long way.
When you have limited space, that can be an additional surface. The only thing I noticed that I didn't care for that much about the EcoFlow was the fact that all of the USBs are on one side and all the 120 is on the other side. So if you do want to use it like slid back into a cabinet or whatever, you're now covering all of those ports on the other side, or vice versa.
Sure.
The way that I've got it set up on the boat, which is just basically under the companionway step, it's not a problem. But I could see how that could very easily become a concern of like, oh, the one that I need is now hidden by all these bags. It's on the other side or whatever.
Yeah. And I believe I pointed that out in the article. That was one of the limitations, but they have since released some new products. I think like the Delta Max.
Oh, sweet.
Which may have addressed some of those issues of bringing, AC and USB ports to one side. They also just released, it might have been that Max or even an additional unit that you can now take to an EV charging station and charge with a car charger. Same concept as this unit. This one can take in 1700 watts AC. The one that goes to the EV charging station, it can take in a huge amount of power in a short period of time.
Wow.
Which is really smart. And I've since seen a couple of the other manufacturers start to integrate that charging technology. Jackery, which I think is a great kind of bargain option. It's not $2,000. It's about $1,000 for the one we tested for this article. They now have units that have integrated AC charging that let in a lot of power. So they charge much quicker. And that, again, it's a really great thing, especially for folks who are like not full-timing, weekend warriors, people who just want to charge up their battery quick and have it last for a weekend. That's such a valuable feature to have.
And it seems like the Jackery is really popular. I see a lot of people using them. Do you think it is because the price point is so accessible?
I think that's part of it for sure.
It's one of the most popular ones I see out there.
It is. I think, to be fair, I think they did a great job of marketing it too. They got it in the hands of a lot of full-time travelers right off the bat. They said, here, take this out. We know it's going to work well in the field. And so a lot of people have been using them, and I'm sure giving good feedback because we've seen them adopt some of these features like that quick charging. They've done that faster than some of the other manufacturers. But yeah, the price point, it's hard, when you look at all of these as a whole, most of them are over $1,000. So to find one right around the $1,000 price point it's a little more accessible. I'm not going to call that cheap, but for what you get, it feels like a good buy.
With a 46 amp hour battery, it looks like it has regulated solar input as well. It's got USB 3.0. It's got USB-C.
Yeah, it's got all of the features that you would really want in one of these. The one we tested didn't have an output for integrating it with a hardwired system, but I believe some of their newer ones and some of their higher levels of units, this was the 1000, they have a 1500, they have a 2000. I think some of those do like a 30 amp output if you wanted to integrate them into a hardwired system like your Scout Camper.
Oh, nice.
Yeah. Yep.
Yeah, and they're just super popular.
Yeah, they're great. They offer a lot of different ones too. They have some really tiny ones, for people that just want to be able to maybe keep a laptop and a camera battery charged. They have ones that are that small, and their solar panels are great too. It's a folding design. It's got a built-in kickstand to keep it at a 45-degree angle, so it's pointed right at the sun. Their whole ecosystem of products is pretty well thought out.
We're going to take a brief break, and we will be right back. This week's episode is supported in part by iCamper. They make innovative hard shell and soft-sided roof tents that are designed to survive long-term overland use. Their revolutionary X cover won the Overland Journal Editor's Choice Award, eliminating the bulky PVC cover and also allowing for the fitment of crossbars for carrying bikes and kayaks. Their Skycamp Mini is another award-winning design that provides a hardshell tent in the footprint of a much smaller clamshell model. This is the perfect solution for smaller vehicles or on vehicles where rack space is dedicated to other systems. iCamper believes that the best times are those spent traveling, discovering the world with those you love most. You can find out more about their quality tents at iCamper.com. Well, let's talk about some of the other ones that you've seen on the market recently. You've got some additional considerations in the article. I guess the one that I'd like to bring up is that Red Arc is starting to pay attention to the success of these things. So they've developed some battery boxes as well that are going to be coming. They're available currently in Australia. They've developed some solar panels as well. And of course, they have their own DC to DC chargers. They have a DC to DC and an AC to DC charging system with integrated solar panel management as well. So Red Arc has got more solutions than before. They have a traditional solenoid operated dual battery system as well. So it'll be interesting to see what Red Arc comes up with in the next couple of years around these integrated systems like this.
Definitely.
Because they've done such a good job with the other Overland components. So that'll be interesting to see. What were some of the other ones that you didn't test or that weren't included in the review that you liked?
One of the ones that I think is really compelling comes from this company called Energy, which is based out of Idaho. And I had one of their earlier models called the Kodiak. It was similar power density to these, like I believe it was around 100 amp hours, lithium, AC output, 12 volt output. And their newer one is called the Flex, and it's cool because it separates the charge controller, AC, and all of the plug interfaces from the battery. So basically the battery is a base and the top, you just sit it on the battery, it plugs in.
Oh, interesting.
And so you can have multiple batteries and you can daisy chain them easily.
Got it.
I would have loved to test that one. Those guys, their production model is more of like a Kickstarter kind of thing. So they don't necessarily have the inventory on hand to be able to send them out. But I had a good experience with that Kodiak. So I think they make a good quality product. And from what I understand, their customer service is great. They're not as well known in like the overland and vehicle based travel space. They're more of like a home unit, or at least that's how they market themselves. But again, being able to have multiple batteries is pretty compelling for people that are maybe spending lots of time off grid or who just want more power in one of these all-in-one systems. That's one that's definitely worth looking at, especially if you go and search on Amazon. There are so many companies, mostly based in China, that are producing these kind of all-in-one units. So beyond the Energy, it's really hard to say. I mentioned a few others. There's this Omni Off-Grid, Blue Eddy, Sunbox Labs, I think is a US based one, but there are a lot of other options out there. The one thing I would just tell people to consider, if you're looking at these alternatives that are maybe a little bit more affordable because they're newer in the space, customer service and support could be very valuable to you if you have an issue, because again, you're not going to disassemble this to fix it if something goes wrong with it. And that's one of the advantages with these established brands is a lot of them have US based customer support. There's probably going to be a person on the other end of the phone that you can get in touch with or via email. Whereas some of these more affordable options that just kind of come from overseas that don't really have, the customer support system in place here, they may be difficult to work with if you have issues. So
yeah, and on such an investment like a product like this, you want to make sure they're going to stand by it. Sure. And I do remember a few years ago, we had a small issue with one of the Goal Zeros, and I didn't go through the PR channels or anything. I just called up customer service. I like to do that when I have an issue with a product just to see what typical consumer would experience. And they're like, oh yeah, no problem. We've actually seen that issue happen. It was the battery was bulging a little bit in the case. They're like, we've seen that happen on a couple of these things. No problem. We'll send you out an RMA and done. Send a new unit. Cool. So they were really great. And I know that companies like Dometic and that will also be that way as well. Yeah. What an interesting development that we've seen over the last couple of years. I mean, this has really come in barnstormed this whole segment, because 10 years ago, you didn't really see stuff like this. Goal Zero was just coming into the space about 10 years ago. And now these things are everywhere. And they're also typically the the solution that people are picking. So I think it's important to talk about it. What do you think are some other considerations about how to reduce the cost of this kind of investment? Do you think that people will oftentimes buy too much capacity, or how do you best determine the capacity that you need for your vehicle?
That really is the starting point, right? That's what you do when you're going to install or design and install a hardwired system. You really start by looking at what you need to power, on a daily basis. And the math is not too difficult. I was able to do it. I used to do terrible at math. So if I can do it, anyone can do it. But, you look at the devices, you look at the power consumption, you multiply that by the number of hours you plan to run them. And before long, you know how many amp hours you need. And then you can go from there. Obviously, it's easier to go overboard and have that buffer. If power is really important to you, unless
it also adds a lot of expense.
It does. And unless you're going way off the grid, power is usually within reach.
Yeah.
So you can also go back to something as simple as like a 300 watt AC inverter that plugs into your auxiliary power outlet on your vehicle. You just run your vehicle when you need power so you don't kill your battery. That makes it really simple. And, and then it's just on demand, you just get it when you need it. And then you don't need battery, you don't need power storage, which is really the advantage of these, right? It's like the power is there. You don't have to be running a gasoline engine or a diesel engine to generate more power. And there are advantages to that too. It's nice and quiet. There's no fumes.
Yeah, no question.
So, but
yeah, definitely replaced these, and then more so these with a solar panel have almost completely replaced the need for a generator.
Yeah.
In the backcountry.
Yeah. I mean, I would say just do the math, do some Googling, look for some resources, do the math, figure out what you're going to need, go from there.
Yeah. And then buy the unit that's appropriate to your requirements, maybe upsizing it slightly to allow for some redundancy or some additional capacity should the requirements around your trip change or the weather conditions change. But for the most part, you don't want to overbuy because these can consume a lot of money, which can be used for fuel and border crossings and other interesting activities as a traveler.
When you can, save the money for the trip.
Yeah, for sure. Well, thanks, Matt. You did such a great job on this article. Again, for those that are listening, you can find the article in the fall 2021 edition of Overland Journal. It's the magazine that in many ways supports the podcast that you're listening to. Becoming a subscriber or picking up a back issue and enjoying this content that the team works so hard to put together goes a long way towards helping the podcast as well. So we thank you all for listening.
Thanks
and we
a lot.
will talk to you all next time.